On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, a 22-year-old named Caleb Sorensen walked into Harlan Jessup's machine shop in Fillmore County, Minnesota, carrying nothing but a paper bag lunch and the address his uncle had written on a napkin. He had no formal training. He had no tools of his own. He had dropped out of the Votech program in Rochester after one semester because the instructor spent more time talking about liability waivers than about metal. What Caleb had was a mechanical instinct that his uncle recognized and nobody else had yet bothered to name, and a willingness to show up early and stay late, which in Harlan Jessup's world was a credential worth more than any certificate hanging on a wall. Harlan Jessup was 61 years old that spring. He had operated the same shop on the same county road for 34 years, in a building his father had built from salvaged lumber and poured concrete in 1949. The shop was not large. 4 bays, 2 lathes, a drill press that dated to the Eisenhower administration, and a welding station that Harlan had rebuilt 3 times. What the shop lacked in size, it made up in reputation. Farmers drove past 2 or 3 closer shops to bring their equipment to Harlan, not because he was cheap, he wasn't, but because when Harlan Jessup fixed something, it stayed fixed, and because when Harlan Jessup looked at a broken piece of iron, he saw not just what had failed, but why it had failed, which is a different kind of seeing entirely. Let me tell you about Harlan Jessup because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he built. And what he built was not just a shop. Harlan had grown up in that same building, watching his father work. His father, Dale Jessup, had learned the trade from a man named August Brockman, who had come over from Stuttgart in 1911, and set up a blacksmithing operation in the same county before the First World War changed what iron was used for. Harlan had absorbed 3 generations of mechanical knowledge through proximity and patience, the way children in musical families absorb pitch and rhythm before they can name either one. He had never attended a formal training program. He had read every technical manual he could find, ordered from catalogs, stacked in a wooden crate beside his workbench, their spines cracked and their margins filled with his penciled notes in a handwriting so small you needed good light to read it. He knew the tensile strength of different steel alloys by feel. He could diagnose a hydraulic problem by sound. He could look at a wear pattern on a gear tooth and tell you not just that it had failed, but approximately when and under what load condition, which meant he could tell the farmer what he'd been doing wrong and how to stop doing it. Harlan was a compact man, 5 feet 9 inches, with forearms that looked disproportionately large on his frame and hands that were permanently stained along the knuckle creases in a way that no amount of scrubbing ever fully corrected. He wore canvas work pants and a flannel shirt every day of his working life, summer and winter, and a seed cap from a seed company that had gone out of business in 1971 that he continued wearing out of what appeared to be pure stubbornness. He did not talk much. He was not cold. Anyone who spent time in the shop understood that quickly. But he had no patience for words that did not carry weight, and most words in his estimation did not. When he spoke about a mechanical problem, though, he was precise and unhurried and thorough in a way that made you feel the subject deserved exactly that kind of attention. He had been married to a woman named Ruth for 39 years. They had 3 sons, none of whom had stayed in the trade. The oldest was a civil engineer in Duluth. The middle son ran a feed operation in the South Dakota. The youngest had gone to seminary and was a pastor in a small Lutheran church in Wisconsin. Harlan did not speak of this with bitterness. He understood that each generation had to find its own way. But there was a space in the shop, a kind of ongoing vacancy, that 3 sons had chosen not to fill, and Harlan had spent 30 years filling it with other men's sons instead. That was the thing about Harlan Jessup that people in Fillmore County understood and talked about in the particular quiet way that communities talk about things they consider important. Harlan trained people. Not in any formal sense. He never advertised, never ran a program, never called himself a teacher. But young men showed up at his shop, sent by uncles or fathers or neighbors who had seen something in them that needed sharpening, and Harlan put them to work. He did not lecture. He demonstrated, and then he watched. He corrected without humiliating, which is a skill rarer than most people acknowledge. He assigned tasks at the edge of what a person could do, not so far beyond their ability that failure was certain, but far enough beyond their comfort that growth was required. And somewhere in the middle of that process, usually without ceremony or announcement, he would hand a young man a tool from his own collection and say something brief and unrepeatable about why that tool mattered, and the young man would understand that the conversation was a kind of graduation. Caleb Sorensen was not the first. By the time Caleb arrived in March of 1987, Harlan had already trained 11 men in that shop over the course of 20 years. Some had stayed in the trade. Some had gone into farming full-time. One had become a high school shop teacher in a town 40 miles north. One had opened his own welding operation in Iowa. But every one of them had left the shop with a tool from Harlan's collection, and every one of them had kept it. Let me tell you about the tools because you need to understand what they were before you can understand what they meant. Harlan's tool collection was not a museum. It was a work in inventory, accumulated over 6 decades, organized by a logic that was entirely his own and entirely legible to anyone who spent enough time in the shop to learn it. The tools ranged from a set of machinist's calipers that had belonged to August Brockman and still bore the scratched initials AB on the handle, to a torque wrench Harlan had bought new in 1958 and calibrated himself every year with a weight and a measured arm, to a set of cold chisels his father had forged by hand from high-carbon steel in the late 1940s, to a tap and die set in a wooden case with a brass latch that Harlan had acquired at an estate sale in 1963, and which contained every standard thread size plus 3 metric sizes that most American shops did not stock. There were hand files in a leather roll, each one labeled with its cut and its age in Harlan's small handwriting. There was a surface plate, granite, 12 inches by 18, level to within tolerances that Harlan checked annually. There was a collection of punches and drifts, some store-bought, some made in the shop, each one shaped for a specific purpose that Harlan could explain in one sentence. When Harlan handed a tool to a young man leaving the shop, he did not choose randomly. He thought about what that particular person had struggled with, what they had learned, what they were likely to face in the work ahead of them. The tool was not a souvenir. It was a diagnosis and a prescription combined. It was Harlan saying, "Here is what you will need, and here is what I know about you." The young men understood this, or came to understand it later, and they kept the tools accordingly, not in drawers with other tools, but set apart, visible, in a place where they could be seen and handled and thought about. Caleb Sorensen worked in Harlan's shop for 4 years. He arrived knowing almost nothing and left knowing a great deal, which is the correct trajectory and rarer than it sounds. In those 4 years, he learned to read a micrometer to the 10,000th of an inch. He learned to braze copper fittings and weld mild steel and hard face a worn plowshare with a rod that deposited a surface harder than the original metal. He learned to diagnose hydraulic systems by pressure testing and by feel. He learned to machine a replacement bushing on the lathe when the correct size was not available from any supplier, which happened more often than people outside the trade would expect. He learned to look at a broken part and ask not just what broke, but what caused the break, because the break was always a symptom, and the cause was always somewhere upstream. He also learned, more slowly and less consciously, the other things Harlan taught. He learned to be quiet when a problem required thinking. He learned to take a measurement twice before cutting once, not as a rule, but as a habit of mind that extended beyond metalwork. He learned that the most expensive solution was rarely the best solution, and that the best solution was usually the one that addressed the actual problem rather than the visible symptom. He learned that a man's reputation was built from the accumulation of small decisions made when nobody was watching, and that this was the only kind of reputation worth having. On the last day of his apprenticeship, in the spring of 1991, Harlan called Caleb to the workbench and handed him a tool. It was a set of combination squares, a 6-inch and a 12-inch, in a fitted wooden case that Harlan had made himself from walnut, with a small brass hinge and a clasp. The squares were Starrett, American-made, precise to within 0.005 of an inch. Harlan had owned them since 1955. He said, without preamble, "A man who measures carefully makes fewer mistakes than a man who measures quickly." That was the entire speech. Caleb took the case and said thank you, and drove home and put the case on the shelf above his workbench where he could see it, and it stayed there for the next 32 years. Now, let me tell you about the others, because Caleb was one of many, and the others matter to this story. There was Dennis Vandermeer, who had come to the shop in 1969 at the age of 19, and stayed for 3 years and left with Harlan's set of hand-forged cold chisels in a canvas roll, because Dennis had a tendency to reach for the biggest hammer available when a smaller, more precise blow was what the situation required, and Harlan had spent 3 years teaching him the difference. Dennis went on to farm 800 acres in Fillmore County, and run a small custom bail-in operation on the side, and he kept those chisels on a hook above his workbench and used them regularly and thought about what they meant every time he reached for one instead of the big hammer. There was Gene Holloway, who had come in 1974 at the age of 24, already a competent mechanic but with a habit of improvising where precision was required, and who left with Harlan's torque wrench, the one calibrated annually with the weight and the measured arm, because Harlan had determined that Gene's most important remaining lesson was the difference between close enough and correct. Gene opened a diesel repair shop in Lanesboro and ran it for 26 years and kept the torque wrench in a felt-lined drawer he had built specifically for it, and he used it on jobs that mattered and thought about Harlan every time he did. There was Owen Peterson, who came in 1978 at 17 and was the youngest apprentice Harlan had taken, and who left 2 years later with the tap and die set in the wooden case with the brass latch, because Owen had a gift for threading and a patience for the slow work of cutting new threads in stripped or damaged holes that Harlan recognized as rare and worth cultivating. Owen became the shop teacher in Rushford, 40 miles north, and kept the tap and die set in a glass-fronted case in his classroom where students could see it, and told them its history on the first day of every school year. There was Silas Gustafson, who came in 1981 and stayed 5 years, the longest of any apprentice, and who left with August Brockman's machinist's calipers, the ones with AB scratched into the handle, because Harlan had decided that Silas was the one who would most fully understand what he was being given. Silas had gone on to open his own machine shop in Iowa, in a town called Decorah, and the calipers sat on the shelf above his main lathe and had not been used since the day Harlan handed them over, because Silas understood that some things are kept rather than used, and that keeping them is itself a form of use. There were others, 7 more between Brockman's calipers and Caleb's combination squares, each one departing with a tool chosen with the same deliberateness, each one keeping it in the same way, set apart and visible, in a place where it could be seen and thought about. Let me tell you about the last years of the shop because they matter to what came after. By the mid-1990s, Harlan was in his late 60s, and the shop was changing in the ways that small shops were changing everywhere in that period. The equipment coming in for repair was increasingly computerized, with diagnostic systems that required proprietary software and dealer-level access codes that independent shops could not obtain. Harlan had adapted to every previous technological shift in his career, from steam to diesel, from mechanical to hydraulic, from carbureted to fuel-injected, with the same methodical attention he brought to everything else. But the shift to computer-controlled systems was different in kind, not just degree. It was not a matter of learning new principles. It was a matter of being deliberately excluded from the information required to apply those principles. And this was something Harlan found genuinely troubling. Not for his own sake, but for the sake of the farmers who depended on independent shops and who were increasingly being told that their equipment could only be serviced by dealers who charged dealer prices and operated on dealer schedules. He continued training. He took on 2 more apprentices in the late 1990s, a young man named Tobias Kruger in 1996, and a woman named Nora Rasmussen in 1999, the first woman he had trained, who came to him with a degree in agricultural mechanics from the University of Minnesota and a precision that exceeded most of what he'd seen in 40 years of teaching. Tobias left with Harlan's surface plate. Nora left with the hand files in the leather roll, because Harlan had watched her work and determined that she already understood measurement and already understood force, and what she needed to internalize was the patience of the file, the understanding that some work cannot be hurried, that the correct surface is reached by accumulated small cuts and not by any single decisive action. Nora kept the files in the leather roll on the corner of her workbench at the Agricultural Extension Office in Rochester, where she eventually went to work, and she showed them to young mechanics who came through the program and told them about Harlan, and some of them drove to Fillmore County to meet him, which pleased him more than he ever said aloud. Harlan retired from the shop in 2003 at the age of 77. He did not announce the retirement. He simply stopped taking new work, finished what was on the bench, cleaned the shop with the same thoroughness he brought to everything else, and locked the door. He did not sell the building. He did not sell the tools that remained, the ones he had kept, the ones he had not given away. He left them where they were, organized and oiled and covered with canvas, as if he expected to return. He didn't return. He moved into a smaller house in Preston, the county seat, with Ruth, and spent the next several years reading and tending a garden and attending the Lutheran church where his youngest son had once been confirmed before going on to become a pastor. He was not unhappy. He was a man who had done what he set out to do and knew it, which is a condition rarer and more peaceful than it sounds. Ruth died in 2007. Harlan continued in the house alone, and the people of Fillmore County continued to think of him and visit him and bring him things from their gardens and their kitchens, because that is what communities do for people they consider essential, and Harlan Jessup was considered essential in Fillmore County in the way that certain landmarks are considered essential. not because they are dramatic, but because they are there, and because their being there has organized everything around them for so long that their absence is difficult to imagine. He died on a Thursday morning in October of 2019 at the age of 93 in the house in Preston in his sleep. His 3 sons were notified and made arrangements for a funeral service at the Lutheran Church the following Saturday. The obituary in the Fillmore County Journal listed his survivors and his years of operation and described him as a machinist and shop operator and community member. It did not mention the tools. It did not mention the apprentices. It did not mention the particular thing he had built over 50 years that had nothing to do with metal and everything to do with the transmission of knowledge between one generation and the next. But the apprentices knew. Let me tell you about what happened in the week between Harlan's death and his funeral, because this is the part of the story that the people of Fillmore County still talk about. Dennis Vandermeer heard the news on a Thursday afternoon from a neighbor who had seen the obituary online. Dennis was 69 years old by then, retired from farming but still running the baling operation with his son. He sat with the news for a while, the way you sit with news that you have been expecting for years and that still arrives with more weight than you prepared for. Then he went to the hook above his workbench and took down the canvas roll of cold chisels. He unrolled it on the bench and looked at each one. 7 chisels, hand-forged, the steel still holding the surface his father had put on them 70 years before. The edges resharpened many times, but the bodies unchanged. He rolled them back up carefully and set the roll on the passenger seat of his truck and drove to Preston. He was not sure, when he started driving, what he intended to do. He only knew that the chisels needed to go back, the way certain things that need to go back to where they came from when the person who gave them is gone. He drove to the house in Preston and knocked on the door, and Harlan's oldest son, the civil engineer from Duluth, answered. Dennis introduced himself and explained who he was and what he had brought, and the son, whose name was David, stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression that Dennis would later describe as a man realizing something he should have known for a long time. David let him in. They sat in Harlan's kitchen, and Dennis put the chisel roll on the table and told David about the shop, about his 3 years there, about what Harlan had taught him. He told him about the cold chisels and what they meant, the lesson about precision over force, about the right tool applied correctly rather than the biggest tool applied hard. David listened carefully. He had grown up in that shop, after all, though he had chosen a different path, and the things Dennis was describing were things he recognized from his own childhood, from watching his father work, from the particular quality of attention Harlan brought to every problem. By the time Dennis finished, David's eyes were full, though he did not cry. Gene Holloway arrived the next morning, a Friday, driving down from Lanesboro with the torque wrench in its felt-lined drawer, which he'd removed from the drawer and wrapped in a clean shop cloth for the drive. He had called Dennis the night before. They had stayed in loose contact over the years, the way people do when they share a formative experience, and Dennis had told him to come to the house. Gene was 73 and had sold the diesel shop 4 years earlier to a young man who had worked for him for a decade, and the torque wrench had come with him when he left because it was not part of the shop's inventory. It was his, or rather, it was Harlan's, and Gene had been keeping it. Owen Peterson drove down from Rushford on Friday afternoon, still teaching at the high school at 61, with the tap and die set in its wooden case with the brass latch. He had told his Friday afternoon class that he had somewhere important to be, which was true, and had driven the 40 miles with the case on the seat beside him, and arrived at the house to find Dennis and Gene already there, sitting in Harlan's kitchen with David and the middle son, whose name was Paul, who had driven in from South Dakota that morning. By Friday evening, there were 5 of them at the house: Dennis, Gene, Owen, and 2 others who had driven in from different directions after hearing the news through the network of calls and messages that had begun when Dennis knocked on David's door. Each one had brought a tool. Each one sat in Harlan's kitchen and told the sons what the tool was and what it had meant and what Harlan had said when he handed it over. The sons listened. They had not known about this, not the full shape of it, not the number of men, not the deliberateness of the choices. They had known their father trained people. They had not known he had been doing it with this consistency and this intention for 50 years. Silas Gustafson drove from Decorah, Iowa, 3 hours, arriving Saturday morning, the morning of the funeral, with August Brockman's machinist's calipers in a cloth bag. He was the oldest of the surviving apprentices at 73, and he had known Harlan the longest, and when he walked into the kitchen and set the calipers on the table with the other tools, the room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has been completed. Nora Rasmussen arrived an hour before the service with the hand files in the leather roll. She was 44, the youngest of the group, and she'd driven from Rochester in the dark that morning and arrived with the files and a composure that broke slightly when she saw the table. All the tools laid out, each one in its case or its roll or its cloth, arranged without discussion in what appeared to be chronological order. The calipers with AB scratched into the handle at one end, the combination squares in their walnut case at the other. Tobias Kruger arrived 20 minutes later with the surface plate, which was heavy enough that he carried it in both hands and set it on the table with the careful deliberateness of a man placing something irreplaceable. There were 14 tools on that table by the time everyone had arrived. 14 tools representing 50 years of teaching, each one chosen with specific intention, each one kept for years or decades by the man who received it. Each one brought back now, not because it was required or requested, but because it was right. The sons stood around the table and looked at what their father had built, and what their father had built was this: a chain of knowledge, hand to hand, tool to tool, across 5 decades and 2 generations, in a county in southern Minnesota where the winters were long and the work was hard, and the people who did it needed to know how. Let me tell you about the funeral service, because it was not an ordinary funeral service, and the people of Fillmore County who were there have not forgotten it. The Lutheran Church in Preston seated perhaps 180 people. By the time the service began, there were more than 250 in attendance, with people standing along the walls and in the narthex and spilling out the front doors into the October morning. The farmers came. The men who had brought their equipment to Harlan's shop for 30 years came. The neighbors came. The people who had known Ruth came. And the apprentices came, all 14 of them, because Tobias had reached Caleb by phone on Friday evening, and Caleb had reached the 2 men trained in the 1970s that Dennis hadn't yet contacted, and by Saturday morning, every living apprentice was either in that church or had sent word that they would have been if geography had permitted. The pastor, not Harlan's youngest son, who sat in the front pew with his brothers, but the local pastor who had known Harlan for 20 years, spoke about Harlan's faith and his character and his decades of service to the community. He spoke about Ruth and about the family. He spoke about the shop and about the reputation Harlan had built through 50 years of careful work. These were the right things to say, and he said them well. Then David Jessup stood up and walked to the front of the church, and he told the congregation about the table in his father's kitchen. He described the tools laid out in order. He described the men and the woman who had brought them, driving from Iowa and South Dakota and Rochester and Lanesboro and Rushford and Dekra. He read the list of names, all 14, and for each name he said what tool they had brought and what year they had received it. He did not editorialize. He did not explain what it meant. He simply described what had happened clearly and in order, and let the congregation understand it for themselves. The church was very quiet during this recitation, the kind of quiet that is not absence of sound but presence of attention. When David sat down, Owen Peterson stood up without being asked and said one thing. He said, he never called himself a teacher. He just showed you what he knew and trusted you to carry it. That was the whole speech. He sat down. After the service, the apprentices gathered in the church hall with the family, and the tools were there. David had brought them from the house in a wooden crate. And people came and looked at them and asked questions, and the apprentices answered. The farmers who had known Harlan and brought him their broken equipment over the years stood in front of the table and looked at the tools and understood something about the man that the daily business of the shop had not made visible. They understood that the shop had not been only a repair operation, it had been a school, conducted without announcement or credentials or any of the formal apparatus of education for 50 years, in 4 bays on a county road in Fillmore County, Minnesota. Let me tell you about what happened to the tools after the funeral, because the story doesn't end at the church hall. The family had expected, in a vague way, to keep the tools, to bring them back to the shop or to distribute them among the sons as mementos. But the apprentices, without prior discussion, had arrived at a different understanding. They had not brought the tools back to reclaim them or to give them away. They had brought them back to return them to the place they had come from, which was the shop, not the house, the shop. David Jessup had the key. He had kept it after his father locked the shop in 2003, not knowing why. The way you keep things you cannot explain the need to keep. On the Sunday after the funeral, the day after the service, he drove to the shop on the county road with his brothers and with all 14 apprentices, and he unlocked the door and they went in. The shop was exactly as Harlan had left it 16 years before. The canvas covers were still on the machines. The tools that had not been given away were still on their hooks and in their drawers, oiled and organized. The wooden crate of technical manuals was still beside the workbench, the spines cracked, the margins full of penciled notes. The air smelled of oil and cold metal and the particular mineral smell of concrete that has been in a working building for a long time. They stood in the shop for a while without speaking. Then, without discussion, the apprentices began placing the tools back. Dennis hung the chisel roll on its hook. Jean set the torque wrench on the bench where it had lived for 40 years. Owen placed the tap and die set in his drawer. Silas set the calipers on the shelf above the lathe, beside the space where they had sat for 60 years before Harlan gave them away. Nora laid the file roll on the corner of the workbench. Tobias set the surface plate on its stand. Caleb opened the walnut case and set the combination squares, the 6-inch and the 12-inch, on the bench where Harlan had handed them to him 28 years before. Each tool went back to its place, not because the apprentices were directed to put them there, but because they had spent enough time in the shop to know where everything lived, and the knowledge had not left them in the years since. When the last tool was placed, David Jessup stood in the middle of the shop and looked at the bench and the hooks and the shelves, and he said, quietly, to no one in particular and to everyone present, "It looks like he just stepped out." He was right. It did. Let me tell you about what the family decided to do with the shop, because this is the part of the story that carries forward. In the months after the funeral, the three sons talked about the shop. The civil engineer and the feed operator and the pastor, none of whom had stayed in the trade, none of whom had been meant to inherit the building in any practical sense, talked about what their father had built and what it deserved. They talked about the tools and the apprentices and the table in the kitchen and the Sunday when 14 people had walked into the shop and put everything back in its place without being asked. They decided to keep the shop, not to sell it, not to convert it, not to let it deteriorate. To keep it and to maintain it, and to make it available to young people in Fillmore County who needed what Harlan had provided. Not a formal school, not a credentialed program, but a place where mechanical knowledge could be transmitted the way Harlan had transmitted it, by demonstration and correction and the slow accumulation of competence, and by the eventual handing over of a tool chosen with specific intention. They reached out to the apprentices. All 14 agreed to participate. Owen Peterson, the shop teacher, took the lead in organizing the arrangement. Dennis Vandermeer donated materials. Gene Holloway spent 3 weeks going through the shop's equipment, servicing and calibrating everything that needed servicing and calibrating, and writing a condition report in the same format Harlan had used in his own records. Nora Rasmussen connected the operation to the Agricultural Extension Network in southeastern Minnesota, which brought in a small grant for equipment and supplies. Caleb Sorensen, who had gone on to run his own fabrication shop in Rochester, came back to Fillmore County and spent the first year as the primary instructor, working 2 days a week in the shop with young people sent by the same informal network of uncles and fathers and neighbors that had sent him to Harlan 30 years before.